Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for coming to listen. My topic today will be on labor markets and savings. I will talk here is the outline of what I will talk about. I'll first talk a little bit about the typical employment history of an individual who enters the labor market after school and stays there until retirement. I will then say that savings are driven by the labor market experience, and I will outline the three types of saving that individuals broadly do, and that's based on some research on consumption and savings behavior that's recently been done. And then I will talk about what do we mean when we say savings rates across countries and one country saves more than another country. What does it really mean? And finally, I will end up with some comments about the imminent retirement of the baby boom generation and where we're going next, and that will naturally lead me to the panel discussion and the discussion of the workshop tomorrow. So let me begin with employment histories. This is something that, since you are in employment, you are probably familiar with it. But typically, employment for young workers is a fragile state. It's not something that lasts very long in any particular job. Young workers will go shopping for the right kind of job for them. They will take jobs and try them out. They will then move on to another job. It's a process of search for a good match, as we say, the kind of literature that we develop. And unemployment is one of those transitional states. In good economic conditions, unemployment for young workers is of short duration. They take it, they leave it. It doesn't really have much of an impact on what they do. The main process that they go through at that time is looking for the right kind of job that they will build up a career. That comes later for them, but in their 20s or in their 30s, when they settle down to the kind of job. I should say, though, that unemployment affects mainly the less skilled end of the young market. For the more professional type of worker, for the highly educated ones, there is usually an initial period of unemployment that is long. Then you get into a job, and you might move from job to job. There might be some unemployment in between, but it's not usually a serious problem for university graduates, except for their initial period. But anyway, both university graduates and less skilled workers will settle down into their job in their late 20s and early 30s. Once they settle down into a job, then job tenures will tend to be rather long. If you look at the aggregate data, you will see a lot of turnover in jobs, but in fact that turnover is driven to a very large extent, I hesitate to say exclusively, but to a very large extent, is driven by jobs with short job tenures. When you first take a job, it might be unstable, but eventually everyone will settle into a job and is going to have a very long job tenure. And that will continue practically until retirement. Now, of course, that's not to deny that there is any unemployment for all the groups, far from it, and in fact, unemployment for all the groups is a much more serious state than unemployment for young workers. It's usually of longer duration, it has a lot of psychological consequences, social consequences, and also it affects later income prospects. It has a scarring effect with your unemployment, and that's where really the efforts of the government to deal with the unemployment problem should and are mainly concentrated. Now, you were told both in the introduction here and also the title that we have for this colloquium talks about micro and macro frictions. So I talked briefly about the micro-frictions, is that the theory of search, which is the theory of market with frictions, really what its main contribution is to explain how the process of job reallocation takes place and the role of unemployment in it. And from there, it derives results about the impact that various market conditions, since here we're talking about the micro-level conditions that the individual is in, affect the state of unemployment, what's the impact of education, what's the impact of unemployment compensation, active labor market policy, and the macro environment. And there's been a lot of research in this second bullet point that you see there, and that's the one that's had the main impact on labor market policy. And we see the diversity that we see even across Europe. Now, from this kind of approach of the frictions and the impact that they have on the match, we can derive a kind of equilibrium unemployment for different age groups and the implications that it will have for the income prospects of those age groups. And from here, we can move on to the macro frictions, by which we mean business cycle shocks, mainly, and business cycles, and make inferences from there about the behavior of aggregate unemployment. And what we find is that unemployment rates for young workers are typically much higher than for older groups, and they're also more volatile in that they go up and down much more. Young workers usually take the brunt of economic recessions and benefit most for recovery. And that's what we are seeing now as well. We are seeing youth unemployment rise by more than adult unemployment. But because of the impact that we know that unemployment has on the skills, there are government programs in place to help the unemployed in most countries of Europe, for sure. Italy, I guess, is a bit of an exception in that instead of government programs to help the unemployed, you have family helping and employ young workers a lot more before they take a job. It much more relies on the family here, a little bit more, a little bit less in Spain as well, but certainly more than the rest of Europe. But there is a lot of spending by the government on these programs, mostly on other countries. Okay, well that brings to the overview, tells you what we've learned about labor market experiences and employment. And now what I want to do is to use that to talk about the relation between what I just described as the labor market experience of the typical individual in our countries and what that implies for life cycle savings. And what I'm going to say and the implications for savings is really within sort of economic research, if you like, is derived from the theory of consumption. The way I would approach it, the way we approach it generally, is to say, okay, here is the labor market history, and here is the labor market experience of a typical individual. Here is how this individual would like to choose his or her consumption patterns, and then the difference between consumption and income is what you get as a savings theory. That's how we would make predictions about what will happen to savings. So savings is very much derived as a residual consumption, and as a result is more volatile than consumption. So typically what we claim is that households in general want to stabilize consumption patterns as much as possible on the basis of their expected lifetime incomes rather than what they're receiving at any point in time. Now, consumption, of course, does respond to current income. If you get a pay rise, then you will spend more on consumption. You are not going to save the entire additional income. There's a number of factors why it might give you this bigger dependence of consumption and current income that goes against the sort of pure theory of consumption, which says that you only care about your lifetime incomes. That would be, you might have liquidity problems, sometimes to maintain your consumption pattern. You might need to borrow heavily, and that might be expensive given your status in the labor market. You might be unsure about what your lifetime income is going to be. When you are 30, you don't know how much money you're going to make through your 30s, 40s, and so on. So you might be cautious in the beginning, and when you start making the money, you spend it more. So we do get a dependency to consumption, sort of consumption depending on your current income, but mostly what the ultimate aim is to stabilize consumption as much as possible. You don't want to keep changing your patterns frequently during your lifetime, and given the income fluctuations that we see, and given that effort to stabilize consumption, I can derive from there a savings pattern during the lifetime. And the savings is, again, the best way to approach it, given the emphasis I'm giving on labor markets, is relate the labor market status to the savings, given the objectives to stabilize consumption. And what we find is that very young people, by which I mean maybe people under 30, they hardly do any saving at all. If they do it, it will be small liquid bank accounts. They might rely on their parents or the state to see them through if they fall into unemployment or if they lose income. The way they stabilize their income is mainly through transfers rather than through accumulated savings and re-spending. As a good approximation, we can forget about that group as a group that is going to generate savings and is going to need savings instruments. Now, beyond that age, what consumption theorists have found is that savings are driven by two major motives in life, two major consumption motives in life. And then there is a third one which is sort of derivative from that. The first one is that, which takes place in the beginning of the stable employment pattern that I described, is saving to acquire mainly a house, but other real assets as well. So initially, an individual will form a household and will want to accumulate savings so as to buy a house and a car and the other durables that we do. Following that, the second major objective of saving will be saving to finance retirement. So it will be in the form of a pension. And the final form of saving, or this saving, but this saving involves some saving, is how to distribute the assets that you have when you reach retirement so as to have a smooth consumption pattern during an uncertain duration of post-retirement period. So let me say a few more things about that and related more specifically to age groups. So starting at some time like late 20s, early 30s, and up to about mid-40s, most of the saving is for the acquisition of non-financial assets. There is some precautionary saving in case you lose a job, and other unexpected events, but that's usually very, very small. Especially in countries with a welfare state that subsidizes unemployment and health, that kind of saving is almost non-existent. Again, to a first approximation, we can assume that the saving there is a kind of temporary accumulation of financial assets to transfer them into a real asset. Then starting at about 40s, now you might think that this age group is something that comes to my head. In fact, it's not modern consumption theory actually identifies that from micro survey. And usually, and the numbers I'm giving you here are mainly using United States data, but I guess European countries would be similar to the United States here. So all they are starting at about the mid-40s to about the mid-60s. The predominant type of savings for retirement, there's a kind of switch from buying real assets like house and car, durables, to saving in financial assets that will yield a rate of return sort of years later. But I guess it happens in modern societies. Most saving for retirement is done through company pension plans or through the government and social security contributions during the working life. Now, what I'd say is that there is a good understanding by households of the implications of company plans and government plans. So any private saving that they do at this point is one that offsets almost one-for-one, or rather it is offset almost one-for-one by government and company. In other words, if say an individual was saving for a pension and then the government comes and says, I've changed my pension plans, now you're entitled to something extra or something less, then usually you would expect the private pension to respond to that, either increase or decrease the private pension saving in response to the change in the public pension. And that's why it's a good idea if there are changes in public pensions to be given sufficient notice before and not to affect the people who are entering retirement now. Now the third, what I'm calling a savings phase, I hope it will become obvious later on why I'm calling it a savings, is something that begins in the mid-60s, and it comes from the fact that we now have generations entering retirement with a lot of money, which might be in real assets like a house, or it might be financial assets. And there's a life expectancy of something like 20 years, 25 years on average after retirement. And what these people will need is to know how to save the income that they derive from the pension, for example, so as to finance consumption during their retirement, given that the objective is that consumption should be maintained during retirement at about the same levels that was taking place during the working life. Okay, given what I said and given the savings objectives and all that, what can we say about the comparisons that I keep hearing about savings in different countries? For example, even today we're talking about why savings in America are so small compared with some European countries. Why are the Chinese savings so much more, and what does it imply? Those comparisons, well, sometimes they're meaningless, sometimes they're dangerous, actually. They could get into dangerous misinterpretations of the data. Because to understand differences in savings rates across countries, we have to take into account corporate saving and government saving, as well as all the kind of assets that people have their savings into. And what I claim is that's next to impossible to evaluate the current the current value of all the pension rights that we have invested in governments or in our employers. Our employers is a little bit easier. In fact, people do it now. Unfortunately, driven by divorce in most cases. In fact, driven by the desire to know what assets each partner has in a divorce, that we have to calculate these assets. But there's still no effort to calculate the government asset. For example, most saving for professional classes in the US is done by corporations. So Americans don't really need, professional American people, men in particular, in fact, don't really need to save for retirement. So that's like taking away that motive, because the company is providing the saving. In European countries, like I mentioned Greece, which might be an unfortunate example now, if you have to rely on the Greek government to save for your pension. But in European countries, in many European countries, most of the saving is done by the government, so you may not need to do any private saving because the government is doing it for you through taxation. And again, if you look at private savings, say they are not saving, it's not that they are not saving because someone else is doing it on their behalf. And of course, in the UK now we have a kind of partnership between public and private pensions, which again need to be taken into account if a comparison is going to be made. In fact, it's so difficult to make these comparisons that in my view, at least, if you really want to know how savings rates differ across countries, you'll be doing much better if you look at investment rather than saving. If you see how investment behavior differs between countries, and then to a first approximation equate investment to savings, and the country that invests a lot more is a country that saves a lot more. Now, some of that investment might be done by foreigners, but that's again saving that's being directed into the country. If you want to know about domestic saving, you need to take investment in the country and deduct from the foreign investment. I think that's an easier way of doing inter-country comparisons. Now, given that difficulty of measuring savings, let me make some comments on the savings dynamics of recent times. Now, for example, aggregate savings rates have been declining in the last 2 to 3 decades. This is one of the things that was emphasized in some of the information I was shown for the conference, for this colloquium. At least up to the recession of 2008, savings rates have been in declining trend. Now, I think the reason that the data shows savings being on a declining trend, the main reason I think is the stock market appreciation. Because we sat through the previous 3 decades experienced the biggest appreciations of stock markets and land prices. And those, of course, are someone's savings. And therefore, when you see the stock market appreciating, then the personal saving that you have to do in other assets can be on a declining trend. And when you add the two together, if anything, it's probably on an increasing trend, the savings. But I also think that the bigger commitment of corporations, big companies, and government to pension provision has also reduced private saving over the last 3 decades, because generally corporations have become more capital rich, and governments generally have access to more tax revenue in more recent times. But I still think the stock market is the main reason for the trend decline in savings. If you look at the dynamics of savings in the recession, there's been a sharp increase in the sort of headline figure of personal savings. And I suspect again that one cause is the previous process in reverse, in the sense that the stock market declined, of course, dramatically since 2008. And so there is more liquid saving to offset that decline in the stock market. And when you look at the figure as published now, you only see the increase in the liquid saving. You say, it's an increase in savings. But in fact, we lost a lot of savings through the decline in the stock market. Americans who usually save their pensions in stock markets have know more about that than we do in Europe, but it's still affecting us here in Europe. Now, the other thing about the current recession is that it's unusual in that it was caused by financial failures, and therefore there's been a large increase in the demand for liquidity this time in the recession when we compare with previous recessions. Now we can see that in how much of the quantitative easing that was done, which is another way of saying putting more money into circulation, and a lot of it is being held in private accounts and not used to buy other assets. It's a typical scenario of a liquidity trap, that you give liquidity to the private sector and then it's just holding it as liquidity with extremely low rates of return. And that demand for liquidity is essentially precautionary demands, because we are too cautious about what's happening in the financial sector to put our money into assets that might have a volatile rate of return. But the way I would interpret what we see in the figures now as an increase in savings is not an increase in savings at all. In fact, savings might actually be going down overall now if you add all the savings instruments. the way we interpret it is that it's a portfolio adjustment of the private sector. And the portfolio is adjusting away from equity, away from real assets like land and housing, and into liquid assets. And because when you add up savings from national accounts, it's usually liquid assets that you add up, it's showing as an increase out in savings, but in fact it's a reallocation which I suspect overall the total saving figure when you add up real assets, real asset values and stock market values is lower than it was in 2007. It's simply a desire to increase the liquidity of portfolios. So let me now come to my fourth topic, which is the end of the baby boom era and employment trends since then. I'm told it's called XYZ, so I put them in my title, and it's quite meaningless really. It's just about the baby boom that I'm talking. Now the baby boom, which is the X generation from what I understand, it enjoyed the most prosperity ever known. It's the first time that we have a generation retiring that has lived and worked through an uninterrupted period of prosperity. So the employment history that I described at the beginning fit this generation perfectly. What's surprising maybe is that it's the first time that we have a generation that they fit in, because the previous generation went through world wars, it went through Great Depressions. You know, our parents' generations, it was only, well, I guess my generation, my parents, I guess we're not all the same age, but anyway. It's only now that we have a generation that entered the labor market late 50s, early 60s and worked through uninterruptedly. And they're entering retirement now with a lot of savings, mainly in their house, in real assets, but also bank accounts. And because of their big numbers as well, when you add them all up, it's unprecedented how much money there is now in the economy waiting to be invested. And the question is what can they do with all that money, given that they want to spend a big fraction of it. And I think that's the problem that you will be facing as an industry, and I hope that this is what we'll be discussing here, because I'm very soon, I guess I am a baby boomer as well, so very soon I will want to know what to do with my money to maintain a high standard of living in retirement without the risk of ending up homeless if I live to be 100. In other words, the big problem is how to run down the value that you have invested in things like your house without becoming homeless if unexpectedly you live more than 20 years as your average expectancy. Now, the Y and Z generations would be are less numerous than the baby boomers, but they also enjoy prosperity. The Great Recession we're going through now, it's hit them more than the baby boomers. But again, they've accumulated savings, but savings are likely to go down because of because their numbers are not as big. And finally, one final slide from what I remember is that I should mention another labor market trend that encourages more saving, which is the increase in inequality. Now, the way that the increase in inequality has come about in labor markets is that through high-income groups taking almost all the gains from the prosperity of the last 20 to 30 years. In America, in fact, the real value of low incomes has been falling for a long time. I think it's stabilized now, but it fell in the 80s and 90s and it's stabilized now. In Europe, and by that I'm afraid it's a more Anglo-centric view of Europe here. Low incomes have stagnated, whereas high incomes have been taking all the benefits that you see as average economic growth. And of course that, although it may not be good for society and social cohesion and life satisfaction, as economists refer to it now, because inequality is generally not good for those things. But there should be more savings available, because people with high incomes save a lot more. There is more inequality in consumptions, but at the same time this is a factor that is encouraging higher savings. So what I'd say is, concluding remarks, is what I mentioned before, that the kind of savings we do depends on our labor market status, but the problem that I would pose for you now, and I guess it's what we want to discuss in the panel, is how can we ensure that people now in their 60s, with a lot of accumulated savings behind them, with expensive houses that they live in, how can we make sure that they maintain the high level of consumption, given the uncertain lifetime, without running the risks of either being homeless or passing far too much to their children, more than they want. Thank you.